Former. Thank you. Put my background. Yeah. All right, so I am retired from Best Buy for about a year now. So it's been an interesting thing. I want to start by first thanking Auditech for a fantastic conference opportunity to participate. I think one of the things I've learned, and I think it's not unique for the other participants, is for certain, the diversity of our companies that we represent all have common themes and commonalities as to what's occurring and making pain points, whether it's for the vendors or for procurement or whatever the case may be. So it's kind of fun to see that and hear that. So I'm not going to drain the slide on my background. I've spent time in audit. I spent time in finance. I've done marketing. I've done store operations. So I've been around the block a time or two. That's why I'm retired. Kind of got me there. But before we get going really into my presentation, I want to have some fun. We need to be more fun as auditors. So
Isn't that an oxymoron?
So the industry has come, the industry has come a long ways since the legend has it. It started in the grocery industry with cans of Campbell's soup, right? They would scan it, and everybody always remembered to collect on tomato, chicken noodle, cream of mushroom. And then they did this crazy thing and added cream of asparagus. And nobody ever collected on that until the audit companies came along after the fact and said, oh, you forgot to collect on that. So that's a claim, right? So we're going to have some fun with the anatomy of a claim. And in doing so, we're going to have $1 million claim. And how do you get to $1 million claim? There's really three ways you get to $1 million claim. You have a small dollar volume and sell large quantities. So we're going to sell the new Taylor Swift album that releases today. We're in the record business, and we're going to sell 1 million copies at $1 off, and we didn't collect it. We just made $1 million, right? The flip side of that is you can have a large item, not very many units, but the discount's large. So you're going to have a $5,000 refrigerator or $10,000 lawnmower or whatever the case may be. You're going to sell fewer units, but if you don't collect it, it's still going to be $1 million. I can't do this lady justice, but she used to have a really good Southern drawl twang, and she said, Chuck, you forgot. You could have a combination of the two. You could have medium price discount and a medium quantity and still get to $1 million. And I said, you're absolutely correct. But the other thing you can do is get there. And what we're going to talk about largely in the presentation today is you get there over time. If you have a small error or a large error, and you have a trickle amount of units going through, but you do not collect it, you can get there over time. Does everybody follow that? So now I need a volunteer. Ben, thank you for volunteering. You are going to be awarded. We're going to play Jeopardy here. I've got the theme music here in just a second. Okay. You just wrote a $1 million claim. Would you like your $1 million today, a year from now, 3 years from now, or not at all? You have $1 million. Would you rather have it today? We're not going to ask you what you're going to spend $1 million on. That's a good. It'll be gone by the time the casino will have. So I think everyone would agree. We'll go to the next slide. Everyone would like to have their $1 million today, particularly in today's economy with inflation, with the cost of capital and everything else. You'd rather have $1 million today because it's not going to be worth less, but it's going to be worth less a year from now, let alone 3 years from now, which is how far in arrears many of us in this industry are auditing. So when we talk about the concept of pull it forward, it's about how do we get closer to the transaction date? Because if you get your $1 million today, we're going to learn some of the benefits of doing that, not only from a capital and cost of capital perspective, but also the relationships you build as part of that. So we did not come up with this concept. We kind of had this concept forced upon us. We did business with a little fruit company. It's another joke, sorry. They sell a lot of things that people have in front of them on their table. And they did not like getting claims on bananas that were 3 years old, or even grapes or anything else that were 2 years old, let alone a year old. So they more or less dictated to us, because they had the most leverage in the relationship, of, hey, we want you to do quarterly reconciliations. So we started doing quarterly reconciliations because they sell a lot of products. And it behooved us to come up with a way of doing that. So we had to get into a mindset of how do we structure our data? How do we get our emails? How do we get our purchase data, everything more quickly? And then do we look at it and reconcile it? And we actually became so good at it that we became the partner of choice with them. They did not want to sign off on any funding until we had validated it, because they said, we just soon not go through the headache of having a recovery audit claim. We'd just like to get it right to begin with. When you do that in your organization, you become the partner of choice, is what I like to call it, rather than the partner of necessity. And it's a great strength of position to do when your phone rings and somebody says, hey, I'm having a problem with vendor X. I need your expertise to go and help me reconcile it and get it done, not a year from now, not 2 or 3 years from now, right now. But we'll talk about some of the tyranny of that as well. So, what is pulling it forward? It's bringing the audit closer to the transaction. It's about managing relationships and expectations in the process. More importantly is you're going to get the time value of money. You're going to get that money up front, and it's going to be better for your organization. It's going to be better for your folks. So before I get into really implementing it, I want to tell a story about a claim we wrote and whether or not pull it forward would have helped. I can't talk about vendors. That's why we had a fruit company. So now I'm going to go with the legendary Acme. Acme sold us TVs. Acme said, our buyer approached them and said, we would like to have you put your latest, greatest technology on the front end cap of our home theater display area in over 1,000 stores. Ooh, we got a big multiplier. We're going to have you do that for X amount of period of time, and we're going to pay you, or we're requesting you pay us $1.75 million. The guy was so excited, he recapped everything in an email, sent a copy of what we call a VPA, vendor program agreement. So, and he recapped it perfectly. He says, as I understand it, we're on the hook for $1.75 million to display the XYZ 1000 and over in these 1,000 stores on this end cap. So elements of a claim, you usually have an offer, you have an acceptance of an offer, you have execution of an offer, and you have either no collection, execution is good. You either have what I call underpayment, total lack of payment, but there's something wrong with collecting on the offer, right? So that's the elements of your claim. So recapping this situation, did we have an offer? Yes, we had an offer. Did we have acceptance of the offer? As I understand it, we're on the hook for $1.75 million. Did we have execution or actually do the offer? Well, the answer there is kinda. This was before the pandemic where we learned the slogan of supply chain issues, but there were supply chain issues with the XYZ 1000 and the company actually stopped making it. So they substituted the XYZ 2001, the latest, greatest product. Do we still have a valid offer? Do we still have a valid claim? We didn't collect anything, but we found it 2 years later. And the sales rep who negotiated the offer, he took his $1 million commission and went somewhere else. And the merchant who negotiated the offer was long gone. So we had that turnover over that period of time. So do we have a claim? This is my wife's favorite term. It's kind of icky.
Pretend.
Yes. So we did not have a claim. We actually walked away from it. But in working with the merchant teams and everyone on it, I was able to bring to the table of, hey, we need to get to this information to you sooner, quicker, better, so you can take action on it, because there's an opportunity cost that was lost for the organization too. If we're not going to collect on that end cap, we could have sold it to their competitor and, got $100,000, got $500,000, got $1, we would have been further ahead. But when you talk about that dispute relationship, Craig, the dispute there got really, tenuous in a hurry because the execution was not our fault. They actually got different products of theirs on the end cap, but we didn't execute on our end well enough to hold up that agreement. So we lost on poor Bridget's 4.5 times more likely if you have an email to have a claim. We didn't have a claim. So that's just one example, as if you were auditing closer to the transaction where you have slippage or breakage that's happening on that. So I like to say you have less amnesia between the vendors and the merchants because it's more fresh, it's more current, and it's more real time, and they likely haven't switched chairs. Years ago, we had two merchants actually switch chairs. They went from one aisle to the other aisle, and their business units were laptop computers and desktop computers. And we wrote over $10 million in claims because both of them thought the other one was going to do all the dirty work from their old job. And we wrote claims behind both of them. So it was just kind of a unique situation. And we found that 2 years after the fact. So I like to think that we get lots fewer assumptions about the intent of what's being negotiated and what's being done. And then you get a lot better calibration and a lot better collaboration and buy-in from your internal partners. So disadvantages. Recovery audit has what I like to call very stringent rules. You can audit your program year from the beginning this year through the last day of the calendar that bumps up against it. When you start doing pull it forward work, you have to think outside the box of, if we see a program that's going to annualize and go into the next year, why stop there? You can stop and call it, this is the last claim for 2022 or 2023. We're going to start writing into 2024. And more importantly, we're going to stop it from going on the day we write the claim, because we're going to correct it real time in the system so that it's not going forward. You do have problems and inefficiencies because you tend to pick the audit up more time and set it down. Annual programs are by definition annually, so you don't qualify until the annual mark. So if you've done any pull it through or pull it forward on anything real-time promotional driven during the audit, you're going to set it down and then have to come back to that audit, refresh yourself with everything that was in the audit, and do the audit to complete it on the annual programs and everything else. So there is some natural inefficiencies there. You're going to have to commit to additional costs and additional resources to get your data more current to you. But overwhelmingly, you're going to have more satisfied customers, both from your vendor community and your merchant community, and also really your people. Your people are going to get a little strained sometimes because there's no idle time. You can always go to look at what we think are positive AI hits. We do have some limited AI telling us, we know this product was discounted on this date to this date. We know that there were, we call it market development funds, another commonality, but there was no market development funds attached to that. So we ended up discounting it. Does that mean we missed collecting those, or what was the situation? You can get a lot of false positives. Great example that Jenna brought up was hand sanitizer. It was a hit record for a while, and then you were left with a lot of it, and then you deliberately sold it at a loss with no MBF attached to it. So it was a false positive on your AI research saying we discounted this SKU way below cost or at a deep discount, but we didn't collect any funding on it. We know why. So my final point in the presentation is it's not about finding more money. I don't know if you're budgeted for your recoveries. At my old company, we were budgeted for them. If you pull it forward, you are robbing Peter to pay Paul. There is no new money in the pool from last time. And I always used to talk with our budgeting folks of, we're in Minnesota, we're going fishing today. What lake are we fishing in and what fish are we fishing for? Because that's going to determine how many fish we catch and how big they are and how much the value of them is. And most of the time people got that, but that's not always the case. What questions do you have?
You're budgeting for recovery, so you're just looking at historic years and run rates and the percent of revenue.
Exactly, yep. And that actually helps us forecast and use pretty rudimentary AI as to where to look, right? So if we know vendor XYZ or Acme or whoever historically has $1 million written on them or 50,000 or whatever the case may be, know that they're a heavy promotional driven vendor, we can look at their SKU activity and focus on them. So that's a great question about where to focus, but that's exactly what we do.
Is it more vendor than category?
Some categories are more susceptible than others. For example, we carry proprietary brands that are unique to us. Those categories are generally not lucrative from a standpoint, and you may have that as a subset class within a category. So we would generally not do those. So it's a good question. And sometimes what creates our audits unique in how we do business, what creates problems is we do, if you have a vendor that does cell phones, home audio, TVs across, they may offer a different percentage in each one of those. So we have unique VPAs, unique vendor numbers, unique hierarchies that all that rolls up to. And there can be a lot of data entries. We've written large claims where they forgot to add the 3%. Then I had an example of that where they forgot to add the 3% to a specific vendor number with it.
You're going to buy, will vendors buy out other vendors or buy out their space where you find anything from a recoverability that never got charged to them?
Yes.
How big a team did you have when you were doing this?
On recovery side, we had a team of 3 that did GNFR audits, and we had a team of 25 that did first pass internal audits, and that includes US and Canada. And within that, we had our own embedded team of 3 people who did our IT support that would help us with the data and put the data into meaningful, actionable formats for our auditors, which is pure golden. That'd be the best place to start with if you're building that internal team. They had such a great reputation within our organization that IT would ask them to validate changes they were proposing to make. We called it vendor funds engine instead of vendor funds management. So it's again, the parallels, as I sit and listen to the conference, are terrific for what everybody does.
How would you, with the data team or the IT team that supported the auditors, how do they prepare the data enough to have it ready to audit, but yet still leave, queries in place where they can kind of manipulate the data? So we're actually looking at, tools today to leverage and pull from the cloud. What kind of a tool do you use for that?
For the most part, a lot of ours was homegrown tools, usually access-based or rudimentary in Excel. And it was most of the auditors have the skill set to be able to use Excel to be able to manipulate data and do it in a meaningful fashion. We're blessed with great tenure on that team, so they kind of know what the auditors are looking for and get it to them in that format so that they don't have to manipulate it as much. And then within emails, we do a lot of keyword searches. For example, on the famous XYZ 1000, we would do a word search from this date to this date on XYZ 1000. What hits did we have?
You do auto deduct on their GNFR?
Yes.
Did you take the timeline for that, or did you get encouraged to like recover all in a certain amount of time or by the end of the year?
Yeah, we did a number of different situations on that. Sometimes when you dig into an audit, you find an issue, you go, okay, how far can we go back within our audit rights? And then I was a big believer and supported us going to current and snapping the line and say, okay, it's fixed as of this date. And then whatever our terms were with that partner is what we would put on the deduction when we put it in our system. So they would get in GNFR, they would get visibility of that, Jason, and then they would know that it's coming. But usually in GNFR, we had a conference with them to tell them, hey, it's coming. Here's what we found, and here's the timelines it covers and why it's a claim relative to the audit rights.
Also, you have to reverse what percentage of what you've audited that did end up getting reversed.
Great question. I'm proud to say that figure went down over the years as we did more and more development of our tools. So we used to, as an organization, reserve a certain part of our recoveries and then reconcile that. And the reserve went from a balance of, I probably can't say, but to probably 10% of that balance over time. And the reason it did is we started to learn and know what our limitations were. We did write the famous claim I talked about as an example, and we did pay it back. It was painful. I had a file in my cabinet that was called the Hall of Shame. That one went in the Hall of Shame. The other thing is changing your team's mindset too, because my background with internal audit, I made a commitment to my VP when I left and came to the new department. He said, would you fix some of the stuff that they do every year and collect every year? So literally my first day in the department, I had an auditor come up to me and say, would you approve this claim? It's $400,000 and I wrote it for the 4th year in a row. That's not how we're building partnerships in the organization going forward, right? That's not how we're doing it.
But to that point, you spoke about, once you identify it, you pull it forward, now we're going to correct it. you find an effective mechanism for having those changes actually get to the system and prevent the following? Does it take a quarter? Does it take 3/4?
Now, it usually is pretty close to the actual quarter where you snap it. And then we would follow up to make sure that it was done. But I think part of that's a two-pronged question. It's a great question. Is one, is it a systemic breakdown to where it's not entered into the system, whether it's vendor funds engine, vendor funds management, or is it a human error where their processes within their department are not tracking this well? And it's a manual collection. So much of, and it's what's unique about each of our organizations, and I go back to that diversity. So much of the industry has changed over the years. We used to have a rhythm of a big 4-color flyer every week in the Sunday. We called it the Sunday insert, right? And if you were the computer buyer, you were negotiating with one computer company for your first week in April, another computer company for the second week. And once you got those done, it was kind of out of sight, out of mind. And the rhythm and everything happening was so tight, and you were always doing that, and you had to make sure it was price competitive. And when you first set up the deal, it may have been at $100 off. And then by the time the deal actually executed, you had to modify it to 150, but it never got entered into the system properly. And then, of course, you always had the issue in our industry, particularly with personal style, when colors came into play. People would collect the black one, the silver one, and the gold one, but they would forget the red, yellow, and blue, whether it was mice or phones or whatever. So a lot of manual processes.
An online question here. Was your team funded by the results of the audit? Yeah.
No. Our funds, depending on whether it was GNFR or it was regular merchandise audit, the funds went back to the P&L of the department we were working with.
I have a question. What data, since you talked about being able to audit stuff in real time, you got to put it in front of your auditors. You have to see current, more current transactions. What's the hard part? Like out of all the data, what was the hardest stuff to get into your audit?
I think it's, given how data is transferred now, Ben, it's all relatively easy to get it. But to get it into, the point Jenna made was really salient, is to get it into a usable format for the auditors that's meaningful, that they can take action on it and take action on it timely. Does take a little bit of scrubbing. But we had the ability to get emails pretty current. Now, the inherent problem with that is you can have information overload, and you have to change your rules, processes, and paradigms as to how you're looking at things. But to get the data in today's environment, there's a lot of data available. It's getting it in meaningful and actionable formatting that they can take action on it.
Utilizing your IT resources.
Right.
Essentially. You understand,
Yeah.
understand it. And how.
If you were to ask me, Chuck, how would I start this process at my company tomorrow? The first thing I would tell you to do is look at your history. Look at where you are finding your current, and that information is available to you. Where are you finding it? What are your top 20 vendors? That'd be a great place to start. Year over year helps you with your forecasting, but it also is indicative of, are those top 20 vendors changing year over year? That's a real easy inquiry to be able to find out. The second thing I would do is say, I would probably have them in reverse order. I would look at what area are you writing the most claims in? Are you writing the most in promotional funding, which is price off in retail? In GNFR, are you writing it off of supplies, or is it off of services? Is it off of lease equipment, whatever the case may be? And then say, okay, do I have parallel vendors there that I may have exposure in? But yeah, we were a very heavy promotional driven back in the day, with the flyer every Sunday. And then you had unique.com pricing. But when you look at that data too, you have to be careful. There's a great positive data point that's a what's the word I'm looking for? A false positive. You lowered the price. You lowered the price because either you might have been overstocked, you might have been matching a competitor. There's a lot of different factors that go into that. We had an issue that we actually escalated within the organization of when the sale ended, we still had tags up in the store, so we were still selling it at the price because they had to match it. So that's where we had good data on the codes as to why the price went down. That was a false positive, right? Went down in price, we should be collecting something, right? No, we were to here. Why did we stop here? Well, we stopped here because the vendor funding ended, but our own retail execution did not.
They've gone to all digital signage in Best Buy now,
I
right?
was just gonna add that,
Yeah.
which they corrected
Yep.
through.
Yep.
a new-
We fixed that problem. We're looking at it, it's just hard to swallow the investment.
Yeah.
But the other thing that I would advise too is when you're writing claims, be specific in how we had a homegrown claims retention system as CRS. Stuff. But we documented everything in there and we were able to run queries on that said emails were 80% of what, I'm making that up, were X% of whatever claims we wrote. We found the claim because it was price by day report that we looked at. So we started really getting crisp and intentional on what was driving the claim. How did we find it? And how could we repeat that? And could we automate anything to look at that within the process without investing human capital? Because I'm very serious, and it's a rewarding job to the people who love it. But when they start getting pulled in multiple different directions, you have to be really, really careful. There's a lot of multiple priorities out there. You have too many proverbial balls in the air.
Did you guys play with prepayment at all? I mean, either the GNFR or actually invoices coming in, reviewing it prior to payment. I know that different environments, you don't allow that with EDI, some of them are so quick, there's not even an opportunity. Construction loans, for example, it's very common.
Yep.
License.
Yeah. Yeah, we played in that space. It has been hit and miss as to, we did a lot of activity in that space relative to offshoring. We did not have the example that you cited earlier, but we had real close to it. Where people were working 24 hours in a day and but they weren't working on the same project at 3 different times. So there are unique situations like that that have come up.
Where did you see your biggest findings on the VNFR side? Where did you have the biggest results category wise?
You can't tell that. Sorry,
No, that's fine. That's like, I keep pinging Jason.
And go down.
Yeah, I try to protect the guilty by changing their names. Yeah.
I'm just thinking categories, like I know Jason said he's done a lot of facilities, done a lot in IT, professional services.
We're very similar, very similar. Another one to look at is recurring payments. Anything you lease, at the end of the lease, are you still paying for it?
Did you have a set process for vendors to dispute auto deductions? I know Craig talked about how everybody has to go through, use the vendor portal. Was there something that you had that was unified that kind of helped you manage that?
Yeah, we had a vendor portal where they had to dispute, and I actually had to add the language in the portal that says disputing the deduction does not make it stop from occurring. You can, and I don't like this deduction is not a valid response. But I always answer that with, what questions do you have about the deduction, right? So.
Greg has mentioned that what helped us a little bit with that reversals. Once we started putting all the recovery in one place, and so it's there, it's less painful. On occasion, we had to do a reversal and there and that. And they had covered up something else with it. We got to that point where it doesn't happen often, but okay, it's still there. It's going to be there for the year. So that's putting all the recoveries in one place, but they did a little bit less painful.
Paybacks in GNFR are very rare.
Yeah, when we run into the same thing, but there's some other things that we do from a deduction perspective and all that, but I agree, we have it from a reserve also, like you're talking about, knowing what you're gonna recognize from a revenue standpoint and what you're not gonna recognize, so that it doesn't all of a sudden become a end of year surprise as you talk, as everybody talks about, so.
Our conversation with finance too is, you can call it all reserve, I guess, because you just keep it in one.
I know I know my former boss is watching, so. We had battle royales over the reserve, so just. say that. Greg, thanks.
Thanks.
Other questions? Thank you.
Real quick, you did talk about the quarterly, the one company.
Yep.
You did, they asked to do it quarterly, right?
Yep.
Was that typically was that typically the closest you were able to bring it to the transaction, or were you able to bring it closer for some and not as close for others, or what was the general guidance on
Yeah,
that?
that's a great question. Pricing claims where they're charging you the incorrect price at cost, you can get real close to the transaction on. Retail price support, where you're dropping the price at retail, you can get really close to the transaction on as well. And then much of the other stuff you have to kind of defer back to the quarterly.
Yeah.
Well, let me know my session and then I'll kind of talk about lunch and next plans. Thanks, John, for your time.
Good answer on